Okay, hey everybody. This is going to be my attempt to actually walk you through the process of following the poem posting directions. So I'm going to show you the process. As always, I will try to toe the line between being comprehensive and giving you useful information and keeping this relatively succinct. So you guys are going to open up your whatever set of poems you're working on. You're going to start with poem set one, and then poem set two, and poem set three, obviously. I'm going to work with sample poems because I'm going to go through the sample that I've already got posted. So let's pretend this is poem set one. I'm going to read all these poems. Oh, beautiful, wonderful stuff. Oh, this one's good. And I'm going to appreciate them and all that. But then I pick one. I say, this one really struck me, or I have a lot of ideas on this one, or I liked it, or I threw a dart and it landed on this one. So, Lesson by Eamon Grennan. Um, I'm going to read the poem out loud, and I'm going to try to understand the literal meaning of the poem first. So, I was watching a robin fly after a finch, the smaller bird chirping with excitement, the bigger, its breast blazing, silent, in light winged earnest chase, when out of nowhere over the chimneys and the shivering front gardens flashes a sparrowhawk headlong, a light brown burn scorching the air from which it simply plucks a ripe fruit, the stopped robin, whose two or three cheeps of terminal surprise twinkle in the silence, closing over the empty street when the birds have gone about their business, and I began to understand how a poem can happen. You have your eye on a small elusive detail, pursuing its music when a terrible truth strikes and your heart cries out. Okay, so literally what's going on in this poem? There's a guy watching a bird, and then another bigger bird comes and destroys the smaller bird, um, and things go back to calmness again. And it sounds like the speaker learned something from that. He says, I began to understand how a poem can happen. You have your eye on a small elusive detail when a terrible truth strikes. So I guess we're connecting this lesson that he learned to a big bird suddenly attacking a small bird. Let's see what we can do with that. Um, and now to answer question one of the poem posting directions, bare minimum of 200 words. What did you notice about the poem? Images, words, language, literary techniques stuck out to you. Why? This is exactly what it says. It can be casual. It should still be organized. I'm going to keep emphasizing that because a lot of times people don't, they lose points because they just write one big, massive, we'll call it a paragraph, but it's not really a paragraph if it's not unified around one idea. So, things I notice. Well, I noticed this poem is only one stanza. That's why I picked this one. It looked the shortest. Um, let's see. What else can I do before I even really, without reading the poem? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Yeah, you learned I can count. It's 13 lines. It's one stanza. Um, Something I might not have noticed right away, but it's one sentence. It is grammatically correct, it's punctuated correct, but this is really a one sentence poem. The lines tend to be kind of long. A lot of times I might count the number of syllables per line to see if I can do anything with that, to see if there's a pattern. I'm not going to do that out loud for you. I'll usually look for rhyme: bird, silent, nowhere, gardens, burn, plucks, three. No, if there was rhyme, I would be labeling it A, and then this is B because it doesn't rhyme, and then this doesn't rhyme because it's C, and then gardens doesn't rhyme with any of those, so it's D. I mean, I'm not going to do that here because there just doesn't appear to be rhyme. I'm looking to see if I missed any, but okay. And then other things I notice. I was watching. It's a first-person poem. A narrator is watching something. I was watching. There's alliteration of the W sound. A robin fly after a finch. Fly and finch. Alliteration of the F sound. The smaller bird chirping with excitement. Nice imagery. Robin flying after a finch, chirping with excitement. Sounds peaceful, sounds calm, sounds upbeat. The bigger, its breast blazing. A lot of B alliteration there. The word blazing is interesting. Silent in light winged, earnest chase. Silent in light winged, light winged. Again, silent. And the scene here seems to be one of calm to me. When out of nowhere, over the chimneys and the shivering front garden. Why are the? It's weird to have shivering front gardens. Why use that word? What the heck does shivering mean? So I notice interesting word choice there. Flashes a sparrow. Interesting verb choice again. I wouldn't usually use that to describe how a bird flies. So I'm just noticing that. I also notice flashes has to do with light and kind of like light, maybe fire. Blazing goes along with that too. Again, I'm making connections that I have already made some of these because I've done this. Um, but really the point here is just noticing things. A light brown burn. I'm noticing a lot of fire words: blazing, flashes, burn, scorching, the air from which it simply plucks like a ripe fruit. I had noticed a simile, like a ripe fruit that stopped Robin, whose two or three cheeps of terminal surprise. Um, I like that word choice. Terminal means that's the end of something. That this Robin just died. Um, why do they twinkle? That seems odd to me. I'm noticing that the verb choice of twinkle is odd to begin with, and to talk about the sound cheeps twinkling, especially when they're cheeps of death. I mean, there's cheeps of surprise because death came. Um, and then we end with in the silence closing over the empty streets. We goes from uh, sound of cheeps and to sound of silence. Let's see, were there other sound words up here? So chirping. So I've noticed some sound words. I might just be jotting down, which I haven't figured out how to do except to type this all up, and it would be messy because I'd like to be taking notes and circling things on my paper. But this is what I'd be doing, just circling these words, these ideas. And then I'm going to see what patterns I notice or what there's a lot of and how I can organize them. And then I noticed the distinct shift at the end. We go back to first person. This was basically a scene of birds. A lot of nice imagery there, but it was a guy watching birds, and now we come back to the guy. I begin to understand how a poem can happen. Colon. Here's the second independent clause of the sentence. So it is one sentence, but it's two independent clauses. One really long one, and then one after the colon as a lesson. How does this tie in? You have your eye on a small. He goes to second person, so it's like he's teaching this lesson to us. Something I noticed. You have your eye on a small elusive detail pursuing its music. Maybe this relates back to watching the bird in the beginning. This little nice chirping excitement. And then all of a sudden a terrible truth strikes and your heart cries out. That sounds like what happened with the sparrowhawk um, and the robin earlier, or was it the smaller bird? I gotta look. Light winged earnest chase on an orange simply plucks the right fruit. Okay, sorry for that. Your heart cries out, being carried off, like the littler bird was carried off by the robin. So I noticed that the author seems to have learned a lesson from watching this scene in nature. Speaking of nature, I noticed a lot of nature words, nature imagery, so I can go back and find all those words. And honestly, that's pretty much it for part one. What did you notice? Then you write this in an organized fashion. Some of the confusion I know comes from part two. What choices has the poet made? How and why do they contribute to the message he is trying to convey? The question I get a lot is, how is that different than part one? And that's a great question because honestly, it's not completely different. It's what this is asking you to do is take your conversational notes and kind of groupings that you came up with that you just noticed and try to analyze them, just like we did in the short story unit where you were analyzing all the words in a single sentence or a short passage. How did those words give the story meaning? I mean, you analyze the meaning of a whole story from just a few words. That's what you're working with the poems here. So the first section is almost having you pick out the raw materials that you're going to use for the second one. The second one is where you're going to say something intelligent about them. And hopefully you can see how I did that in my sample, which I didn't have open. So we'll go to my samples and lesson sample post. And this would be my post on lesson. You could stop listening now if you want to just read this on your own, but I am going to go through this. We're only 9 minutes in. We can spare another 4 minutes. So my title, catchy title, I think, Death Lessons rather than Life Lessons. We heard the term life lessons all the time. So here are the things I noticed. Again, you kind of heard me walk through as I read the poem out loud, just these things I'm noticing. So after I did that, I would have had notes scribbled all over this paper and I would have started to group them. We always want ideas in groups. That's what paragraphs are. So the first things I notice in this one are structural. First, the poem is pretty short. Good. I mean, I could write conversationally. In fact, it's exactly 13 lines, which makes me wonder if it's deliberately not a sonnet, which is 14 lines. You might not know that. Maybe you don't know much about sonnets. Sonnets are 14 lines. They're very formal, very structured. So when I see something that's 13 or 15 lines, makes me wonder, like, why did the poet go for a sonnet? He chose not to, and he chose to go close, but not exactly. Anyway, that said, the lines themselves are pretty long. I counted an average of 10 plus syllables per line. See, I did take the time to count the syllables. It took me a little while to realize it, but the whole poem is actually only a single sentence. It's punctuated correctly, and it's not a run-on or anything, but it's so long that that was easy to miss at first. I wonder how many of you noticed that. Again, I noticed it right away in this video because I've read the poem and already written this, but the first time I read it, it took me a little while to realize, hey, this is a single sentence. There's also a distinct shift in verb tense from past tense, was watching in line 1, to present tense, flashes in line 2, so I noticed that about the verbs. Finally, I do not discern any rhyme pattern, and there generally is not even punctuation at the end of each line. All the things I noticed, some of those I didn't say out loud as I redid this. A lot of poems have commas or other punctuation at the end. This one really doesn't. I mean, we got a comma here. Other than that, it's the period at the end. Notice how I organized. These are all the things that I noticed for structure. I didn't analyze anything. I just told you what I noticed, and I got a pretty good paragraph out of that. Then I'm going to talk about the content I noticed. So in terms of content, I noticed a couple of distinct shifts. My topic sentence tells you that this is going to be the content stuff I noticed. Throughout, there's a lot of nature, but it begins with the speaker observing a peaceful and playful scene in nature. It then jumps to a sudden violent scene. Then the scene returns to peaceful and calmness. That's what I noticed. Finally, the end is where the title comes in, as the focus is once again on the speaker. After watching this natural scene unfold, the speaker learns how a poem can happen. That is the lesson of the poem. I'm not going to analyze and explain that yet, but I did notice that if the poem is called lesson, there was a lesson in there, and the lesson is what the speaker learned, how a poem can happen. Suddenly, when you're not paying attention and there's this flash of a violent, I don't know why he uses violent, we can analyze that in the second part, violent brilliance. But again, all I talked about part 1, the content that I noticed. There are definitely some literary devices at play here too. So these are going to be the literary devices I noticed. Because of the lesson at the end, I think the whole bird scene really becomes a metaphor. Metaphor is a literary term. I'm going to use that. The lesson learned is relayed in language that echoes the natural scene, but I'm going to get into more analysis of that in the next part. I'm going to save my analysis. I'm going to save my smart ideas for why I think the author made these choices, how he constructed it. Right now, I'm just telling you what I noticed. I noticed a lot of alliteration. Was watching, fly, finch, bigger, breast, blazing, and that's just in the first 2 lines. Finally, I noticed a bunch of sound imagery and sight imagery that particularly has to do with fire, chirping, blazing, flashes, burn, cheeps, twinkle, silence, music, sound imagery. Not all of that has to do with fire, but it's sound and sight imagery, and a lot has to do with fire. And that's it. So hopefully part 1 really is pretty easy. It's what did you notice? It's forcing you to take the time to read the poem, and I almost don't even want to say think about it too deeply, just notice things. So take the pressure off on this first one, and look, I don't think anything really particularly intelligent to say in this first part, because I'm not analyzing anything. I don't feel the need to explain the deeper meaning. It's just, I noticed the poem is short. I noticed it's 13 lines. I noticed that there's a lot of syllables per lines. I noticed that there's a shift from past tense to present tense. While I said this, it's not that this doesn't require some thinking, but it requires thinking in the sense that it's encouraging you to notice little things, to take the time to read the poem and read it over again, and just come up with ideas. What is in the poem? What are things that you might not notice at first? Maybe you wouldn't have noticed a metaphor, or the fact that there was no punctuation at the end of the lines. So read it again, and the more poems you read, the more you'll notice different things that, hey, how just looking at it or reading it and from how it sounds, is this poem different than this poem? So that'll help you notice, well, what's in this poem. All right, now the more academic part, the part where you are going to do thinking, but the thinking is going to be easier because you've got all your brainstorming notes, you've got all your ideas. So I'm going to structure this a little bit more like an essay. I am going to have a little intro. I don't think, let me check real quick. I don't think I say that directly in the instructions, but I do say it should be written academically, no first person. And again, it should be organized. So even if you don't have a little intro, I think this This helps. It helps structure my own writing, honestly. By having an intro with a thesis, the thesis helps me as much as it helps the reader. It lets me know where I'm going. It lets me know what I'm trying to prove. So again, let's pull this up. Poem posting directions. What choices has the poet made? How and why do they contribute to the message he is trying to convey? Okay, so let's make sure I do that. In the poem lesson, Eamon Grennan chooses to show how inspiration can strike suddenly and unexpectedly. That's a choice he made. Notice I'm echoing the language of the question. He does this by depicting a speaker watching a natural scene unfold that ultimately leads him to a sudden insight. Grennan uses beautiful imagery and an extended metaphor to get his point across. This is what he did. This is what he chose to do in order to reach his goal of showing how inspiration can strike. This is what I'm going to prove. Beautiful imagery and extended metaphor. The lesson that the speaker learns is the same lesson that Grennan wants the readers to learn, and he has turned this one-sentence description into a metaphor. That's what he did. He makes this clear as his final 3 lines parallel what he has just witnessed. The speaker has his eye on a small elusive detail pursuing its music, which is him watching a robin fly after a finch. So I told you he makes it a metaphor. I told you I noticed that up above. Here I'm analyzing. I'm proving it. Here's my quotation. Here's my evidence. This is these are the final lines. This is the first line. See how they connect. He notices very specific details about the birds, chirping with excitement and breast blazing, for example. Grennan chooses the word music to express the harmony and serenity of the scene. Specific word choice. Then a terrible truth strikes. Remember, this is how you quote line breaks in poetry. That shows that there's a line break there. And your heart cries out, being carried off. This part, where the speaker actually learns the lesson, is expressed in the metaphor when, out of nowhere, flashes a sparrowhawk headlong. Again, I'm proving that he chose to use a metaphor to prove his lesson. So I'm connecting lines from the beginning to lines from the end in this case. Because that's what I noticed. That's what I think he did. That was his choice. The sparrowhawk is the terrible truth because it violently and suddenly interrupted the peaceful scene and minute detail that the speaker was observing. The speaker's heart being carried off is the same as the robin being carried off. This metaphor exemplifies the lesson of the poem. Inspiration strikes out of nowhere, especially when one is not looking for it. Hopefully, this is a thorough explanation and analysis of how Grennan used the poem as a metaphor. Some other ideas, some other choices he made. To emphasize the abruptness with which inspiration strike, Grennan chooses to include a lot of fire imagery. While fire can represent passion and destruction, the words Grennan chooses also emphasize its momentary intensity. Twinkle and flashes are more peaceful, but also suggest something ephemeral. Blazing and scorching suggest a strong intensity. So I went back to my idea that I noticed a bunch of fire words. Okay, what can I do with those? Why would he use those? Why would he include so many? How does that tie into the theme of the poem? Well, here's where I explain it. And look, I didn't have a whole lot of explaining to do. I only have, I think, is it 3 sentences? As I silence my phone, 3 sentences in this little mini paragraph. But it's organized about he chose to emphasize the abruptness by using fire imagery. That's my main idea. I have 2 sentences to prove that. Perfect. I'm going to move on to the next mini paragraph. Finally, even Grennan's choice of structure contributes to his message. Again, this is me going back to part 1, and I noticed a lot about structure. So now I'm doing thinking, okay, can I analyze that and turn any of that into ideas that tie into the theme of this poem? How can I make the things that I noticed, how can I connect them and analyze them? Again, I want to liken this again to the close reading where you pick a line and then you analyze its meaning. So I noticed this stuff. Okay, anyway, his structure contributes to his message. The fact that this is one sentence demands that the reader read it through without pause. The reader is forced to experience one moment after the next and be carried away with the scene just as the speaker is. I thought that worked for why is this one sentence? Well, this is an analysis of what having the poem be one sentence makes us do. Grennan even chooses not to incorporate rhyme or punctuation at the end of his lines, since that would only slow things down as well. So by not having rhyme, not having punctuation, and having this be one sentence, we read this fast. We read it like it's one sentence. He doesn't give us a chance to pause. That's what he does to kind of put us in the same mood, I guess, as the speaker who's watching this sudden moment happen. All of this adds to the intensity of the poem. It's fast-paced scene right up until that final lesson is set off by a colon. The colon adds the first real pause for the reader. It's the place where he can pause to collect his thought for a moment, just as the speaker pauses to collect and share his insight about how a poem can happen, or more broadly, how inspiration can happen. So this is why he made the structural choices he did. Do I know these are why he made these structural choices? Nope, never talked to the guy, never met him, have no idea. But I'm using my own interpretive and analytical faculties, the things that I want to continue to develop in you, and that particularly the skills that we worked on developing in the close readings, you're using those same skills. How can I tie, in this case, not just words sometimes, but even structure, even sound to theme? So first I'm going to notice all this stuff, and then I'm going to do that critical thinking of how can I connect this to theme. And notice both of these are a lot longer than the minimum requirement. If you're going for an A, that's kind of what you don't have to put the word count, but that's kind of what you're looking for, much longer than the required 200 words. If you're going for C range, 200 words is fine. But again, hopefully this was helpful, and it's time to stop this video because it's going to take forever to upload. Any other questions? Just ask on the course questions board. Okay, hope this helps, and good luck with Poem Set 1. Poem Set 1 is probably the most difficult because a lot of the poems are older, so don't get too frustrated. Use a dictionary to look up words. That's absolutely fine. And again, especially part 1, by starting this with part 1, what do you notice? It's a low stakes thing. You're just looking for things you notice. Question 2 sounds similar because this is me kind of easing you into the analysis rather than just having you analyze a poem. It's first, now take the time just to notice stuff without the thinking. Then after you've got all these ideas, well, look, now you have something to analyze. You have all these ideas to think about and analyze for part 2. Okay, I said this was over, and now it actually is. Thanks for watching.